My son said he was taking me on a wellness retreat after my fall, but when we arrived, he tossed my medication bag on the ground and told me to get out. Just before driving away, he said, "You'll be fine. It's peaceful here." Then he locked the door and left me alone. A 71-year-old sick woman in a powerless storage shed in the middle of the snow-covered woods. I once believed a mother's love could never be broken, but when the lawyer arrived and mentioned the $7 million estate, I finally saw who had been playing family. I was still healing from the accident. My ribs ached when I breathed too deep, and the bruises along my arms hadn't faded yet. But Evan insisted on taking me out of the hospital early. He said fresh air and quiet would do me good. I didn't question it. I trusted my son. The drive was long, he didn't say much, and I didn't press. We passed through towns I didn't recognize, then dirt roads, then no roads at all. When we finally stopped, I thought we were lost. But Evan turned off the engine and got out. He opened my door, lifted my bag from the trunk, and pointed to a metal building up ahead. It wasn't a cabin. It wasn't even a house. It was a shed. Big, empty, cold-looking, set against a backdrop of trees and snow. He helped me out of the car. I held onto his arm for balance, still shaky. He walked me to the door, pulled out a key, and opened it. Inside there was a cot, one blanket, a space heater that didn't hum when he plugged it in, no kitchen, no bathroom, a small cooler with some juice bottles and a loaf of bread. He avoided my eyes. I sat down slowly, confused. My chest felt tight, not from the injury, but from something I couldn't name yet. He said, "You'll be okay. It's peaceful here." Then he placed my medicine next to the cot, patted my shoulder, and turned around. He didn't come back. That first night was bitter. I wrapped the thin blanket around myself and listened to the wind howl outside. No reception, no signal, no sound except the cracking of trees in the cold. I couldn't sleep. My chest hurt, and the silence pressed in like a weight. By the second day, I knew this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't forgetfulness or busy schedules. Evan had left me here, on purpose. I kept thinking back. What did I miss? When did his hugs turn cold? When did Tanya's smile stop reaching her eyes? I had given them everything. When Evan and Tanya struggled to pay their mortgage, I covered 3 months without telling anyone. I babysat their daughter for free every weeknight. I signed the papers when they needed a co-signer for their second car. And still, somehow they saw me as a burden. It stings differently when betrayal doesn't come from strangers. Maybe you know that kind of pain. When someone you raised stops looking at you like you matter. When your worth becomes invisible. By the fourth day, I had made a decision. If I got out of this place, I wouldn't go back to being the quiet, convenient woman in the corner of their lives. I would become someone they didn't see coming. But first, I had to survive the cold, and silence, and truth. And that was just the beginning. The morning after Evan left, I woke to the sharp sting of cold air on my cheeks. My fingers were stiff, my legs numb. The space heater still wouldn't turn on. The only warmth came from the thin blanket wrapped around my shoulders and the slow burn of anger that had taken root somewhere deep inside me. I forced myself to sit up. My back screamed in protest, but I didn't let it stop me. I took small bites of the bread. The juice was half frozen. I took my medicine with it and hoped it wouldn't upset my stomach too much. There was no mirror in the shed, but I imagined I looked pale and older than ever. On the second shelf above the cooler, I found a flashlight. It barely worked, flickering every time I moved it. Still, I used it to scan the corners of the shed. No phone, no radio, No way out except the door he locked behind him. I started keeping track of time by the light through the cracks in the metal walls. Midday meant the ceiling glowed. Night brought only silence and shadows. I slept in short stretches, startled awake by the sounds outside. Branches hitting the walls, something scurrying across the floor, my own coughing. By the third night, the food was gone. The next morning, I dragged myself to the door and knocked. Not because I thought anyone was there, but because I didn't know what else to do. I knocked until my knuckles turned red, then slumped against the cold metal and closed my eyes. That afternoon, I heard tires on gravel. I stayed still, unsure if it was real. But then I heard the engine cut and the crunch of footsteps. I held my breath. The door creaked open. It wasn't Evan. A young man stood there, probably in his 20s, wore a brown jacket with a sheriff's patch on it. He looked surprised to see me, asked if I was Florence Langford. I nodded. He said someone had called in a noise complaint from a property nearby, and he decided to check this area too. Said this place wasn't zoned for residential use. He asked how I got there. I didn't answer right away. I just asked him to take me somewhere warm. He helped me into his car, turned the heat on high, called in to dispatch, said he had an elderly woman in poor condition and was heading toward Fairbrook General. At the hospital, they ran tests, said I had mild hypothermia, but my vitals were stable. They let me rest in a private room, gave me soup and clean blankets. While the nurse changed my IV, she asked if there was anyone she could call. I thought of Evan, his voice. That final pat on my shoulder, like I was a stray dog he couldn't take in anymore. I told her no. I told her I had no one. She nodded and didn't ask again. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and let the pieces come together. Evan knew that place had no heat. He knew I couldn't walk more than a few feet on my own. He had filled the cooler just enough to keep me quiet for 2 days, not enough to help me through a week. He had planned it, carefully. And Tanya. Her silence wasn't accidental either. I was never meant to come back. But I had. And I was starting to remember everything I still had access to, including something I hadn't told them, not even once. Something worth $7 million. I was released from the hospital on the 5th day. They offered to call a social worker, maybe set up a short-term care facility, but I declined. I asked for a ride to the public library instead. I needed a place with quiet, heat, and internet. More than anything, I needed to think. I settled into a corner desk near the back, plugged in the laptop a kind librarian let me borrow, and opened a private folder I hadn't touched in years. Inside were scans of documents my late husband had entrusted me with before he passed. They were all there. The trust agreement, the deed to the Birchfield property, his handwritten letter, sealed in an envelope I had never opened, and the schedule for a delayed will reading set to occur in less than 2 weeks. He had written it into the terms himself. No changes were allowed unless both parties were present, and both parties meant me. I had forgotten just how thorough he was. I clicked open the folder labeled Birchfield Ranch. It wasn't much to look at on paper, but that land held value, especially now that a nearby developer was building a private retreat center. The last estimate put it close to $7 million. The property had been in his family since the 1940s. We had never talked about selling it, but he had always said it would go to the person who respected legacy, not entitlement. I had a feeling I knew who he meant. Still, I needed proof of what Evan and Tanya had done, what they planned to do. I logged into the shared account Evan used for my utilities. It had been emptied 2 weeks earlier. The car insurance had been cancelled. The second mortgage I had helped co-sign, paid off the day after my hospital discharge, but not from their account, from mine. I went cold. It wasn't just abandonment, it was theft. I printed out the statements, made copies, and slipped them into a file. I wasn't sure what I would do with them yet, but something inside me had shifted. The woman they thought they left behind in that shed was gone. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt something cleaner, sharper, like ice carving through fog. I left the library just before sunset. The air bit through my coat, but I didn't shiver. I took the long walk to a small motel on the edge of town and paid for a week up front in cash. I asked for the quietest room they had. No TV, no distractions, just me and what came next. Each night I went over the records. I traced the phone numbers connected to the withdrawals. One belonged to Tanya, another to a legal firm I didn't recognize. I looked them up. Turns out, Tanya had visited their office 2 days before I was taken to that warehouse. She'd been asking about power of attorney. They weren't just trying to get rid of me. They were trying to replace me. I thought of the way Evan used to crawl into my bed during storms when he was little. How his tiny fingers wrapped around mine like I was the safest place in the world. Now, I was an obstacle. I placed the sealed letter from my husband on the motel nightstand. I wasn't ready to open it yet, but I would. And when I did, I would know exactly what to do with the truth. They thought they buried me, but I had just started to dig. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose. I wrapped myself in an old cardigan and sat on the edge of the motel bed, listening to the hum of the radiator. I had dreamt about Robert, my late husband, for the first time in months. He was standing on the porch of our old home in North Carolina, smiling, holding a letter in his hand. He looked proud, and that image clung to me, like the last warmth before a storm. I finally opened the letter that had sat on the nightstand for 3 nights. His handwriting was still firm, even in his final days. He wrote about legacy, about how he had feared Evan's change in recent years. He suspected Tanya had influence, but he never expected them to go this far. He told me to hold on to my integrity no matter what. And then he wrote a single line that changed everything. You are the sole trustee of Birchfield. No decisions can be made without your presence. No transfer is valid unless you sign. I folded the letter with steady hands and slipped it back into the envelope. The rest of my morning was quiet, methodical. I packed my documents into a waterproof folder, tucked it into my bag, and made my way to the Community Legal Aid Center downtown. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen enough. She handed me a clipboard and spoke gently when I asked for assistance with financial coercion and attempted asset manipulation. She didn't blink, just told me to wait. An hour later, I met with someone named Russell. He was young, maybe early 30s, but sharp. He listened, he took notes, he asked for the documents. I handed them over, including the letter from Robert. When he finished reading, he looked at me and said nothing for a while. Then he leaned back and nodded. We can build a case, he said. This is clear exploitation. If they filed anything claiming your absence as consent, we'll challenge it. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. But something inside me relaxed, just a little. Like I wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few days, Russell and his team helped me organize everything. We subpoenaed account logs, requested footage from ATMs, tracked emails. He even arranged a forensic review of the power of attorney form Tanya had tried to file. It wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. In parallel, I contacted the executor listed on Robert's will, a man named Curtis, an old friend of his from university. Curtis hadn't heard from me, so Evan had told him I was abroad on medical treatment. That explained why the reading was delayed. I corrected that detail. The new reading was set for Friday at 3 p.m. in the law office downtown. Curtis would be there, so would I, and if Evan and Tanya showed up, they would have no idea what was waiting for them. On Thursday night, I stayed up in the motel, preparing. I didn't pack much, just the essentials. My ID, my documents, my cardigan. I braided my hair like I used to when Robert and I were younger. There was something comforting about small rituals when everything else felt like war. Before turning off the light, I stood at the window, looking out at the gas station across the road. Two kids were buying hot chocolate, laughing in the cold. I remembered Evan at that age. I remembered thinking I would protect him from anything. But some things you can't protect your children from, especially not from themselves. I didn't know how tomorrow would end, but I was no longer afraid of facing it. Friday came with a stillness that felt unnatural. The motel room was quiet, too quiet. I got dressed slowly, folding my cardigan with care, then pulling it over my blouse like armor. The air outside was crisp. I walked 3 blocks to the law office without rushing, each step echoing with memories I didn't want but couldn't avoid. Curtis met me in the lobby. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes softened when he saw me. We walked into the conference room together. The table was long, polished, with stacks of legal folders neatly arranged at one end. Tanya arrived first. She was wearing a silk scarf and oversized sunglasses indoors, as if either could cover the coldness in her face. Evan came in 2 minutes later, smelling like a cologne I didn't recognize, with tension in every movement. He didn't greet me. Curtis cleared his throat and began. His voice was even and calm, but every sentence struck like a gavel. The will had been finalized 8 months before Robert passed. Evan had been given control over minor trust operations for tax purposes, but every major decision required a signature from me, the sole trustee. Birchfield Ranch, the accounts tied to it, and Robert's personal investments, everything was under that clause. Curtis paused, then slid a folder across the table. Inside was the letter Robert had written to me. It was now a legal exhibit. Tanya's jaw clenched. Curtis continued. A forensic review of the attempted POA transfer, along with bank withdrawal attempts, had been completed. All irregularities had been documented and submitted. The legal team was moving forward with filing a formal complaint of fraudulent manipulation. Evan's hands twitched. He looked over at me, and for the first time, I didn't look away. He asked Curtis why this was happening, why the will had changed. Curtis didn't flinch. He explained the will hadn't changed. It had simply never been read properly because Evan delayed the meeting, citing I was out of the country. I stayed silent. Tanya adjusted in her seat and whispered something to Evan. He shook his head, rubbed his temples. Then came the final detail. Curtis announced that, per Robert's instructions, the trust assets would be reviewed for full restructuring, effective immediately. As trustee, I had authority to reassign control, dissolve side holdings, and initiate full transparency audits. Tanya snapped. She stood up and accused me of poisoning Robert's mind. Her voice cracked when she shouted that I was too old to handle millions. Evan didn't stop her. He just sat there, sinking further into himself. I remained seated. My voice didn't need to rise. I told them I had stayed quiet out of grief, that my silence was never weakness, only mourning. I looked at Evan and said I had once trusted him with everything, but no longer. Curtis wrapped up the meeting. Tanya stormed out. Evan lingered, shoulders sagging, then followed her like a man walking into fog. I sat alone for a few minutes after they left. Curtis offered to walk me out, but I said I needed a moment. When the door finally closed behind him, I let out the breath I'd been holding. That day didn't give me back my husband. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it handed me back something else: my name, my rights, and the quiet power of being the last one standing with nothing to prove. The war they started was over, but the rebuild, that would be mine alone to shape. I left the law office with nothing in my hands, but everything restored. For the first time in months, the weight in my chest loosened. I didn't rush down the steps. I didn't turn to see if Evan or Tanya were still nearby. I walked slowly, letting the cold air hit my face and clear my thoughts. That evening, I returned to the motel, packed my bag in silence, and checked out. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't call anyone. I simply left. I spent the next week staying with an old friend of Robert's, Evelyn, someone I hadn't seen in 20 years. She lived outside Charlottesville in a cozy bungalow filled with worn quilts, soft lamplight, and the smell of cinnamon tea. She didn't ask questions, just welcomed me like time had never passed. We sat on her porch in the early mornings, sipping from chipped mugs, and I began to speak. Not all at once, not everything, but enough to finally hear my own story aloud. She listened the way real friends do, with no judgment and no eagerness to fix. And then came the next letter. Curtis had sent an update. The court had issued a protective injunction. Evan and Tanya were formally barred from accessing any financial instruments tied to Robert's estate until further notice. They were being audited. Tanya's prior withdrawals had triggered multiple alerts. The investigators were moving forward. I folded the letter and placed it in my handbag. I didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity, like fog lifting. I stayed with Evelyn for 2 more days, helping her in her garden, organizing her kitchen drawers, and listening to records from the 60s. One afternoon, while washing dishes, she asked if I planned to go back to Birchfield. I paused, then nodded. Not to live, but to look it in the eye. One last time. The ranch had already been placed under professional management, thanks to Curtis and the trust. I wasn't going to uproot everything at 72, but I needed closure, not the kind that came from burning bridges, but the kind that comes from crossing them fully awake. The drive back was long, but I didn't mind. I stayed in a small inn near the property line and visited the ranch early the next morning. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The gate creaked the same way it always had. The front porch still sagged slightly to the left. But inside, the silence wasn't hostile anymore, just empty. I walked from room to room, touching familiar walls, letting my fingers linger on worn door frames. In the kitchen, I stood where I once baked Robert's birthday cake. In the hallway, I ran my hand over the spot Evan scratched as a boy with his toy truck. Upstairs, the room where Tanya had once insisted I move, so she could have the master suite, was cold and lifeless. I didn't open her closet. I didn't need to. I sat on the edge of my old bed and took a deep breath. This house had seen love. It had seen betrayal. It had held everything I thought I was and everything I had to lose to find who I really am. And when I finally stood up and walked out, I didn't look back. I locked the door behind me, placed the key in a sealed envelope, and dropped it off at the property manager's office. My name would remain on the deed, but my life was no longer tied to those walls. The past was acknowledged, and now I was ready to step into what came next. Not as someone abandoned, but as someone who had learned to leave on her own terms. I returned to Evelyn's house, carrying nothing more than a small duffel bag and a folder with Curtis's latest documents. She greeted me at the door like no time had passed, wrapping me in a soft embrace that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil. Her home had become my anchor. It wasn't grand or new, but it was safe. That meant everything. Curtis called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Not because I didn't want to hear what he had to say, but because I needed a moment to prepare myself. I played his message twice before I sat down to respond. The court had finalized the asset freeze. Tanya's false withdrawals had gone beyond simple overreach. She'd created forged authorizations, one even bearing what appeared to be a copy of my signature. Curtis said the investigators were preparing to press charges. Meanwhile, Evan's name had been removed from any claim to the trust. His role in my abandonment and in misleading the financial firm was documented in the filings. The consequences were finally real. But none of that brought peace. Not yet. Evelyn had a cousin who worked in private care coordination. She arranged a meeting for me with a woman named Harriet. Harriet helped elderly women recover their financial independence, especially those recovering from coercive family dynamics. She wasn't a therapist or a social worker. She was practical, blunt, and exceptionally organized. She met me at a diner 2 towns over. I wore my best sweater and brought along a notebook. Harriet didn't coddle. She asked how much I had left. Not just financially, but emotionally, physically, socially. We made a plan. Within 3 weeks, I'd opened my own account under the legal protection of the estate's trust umbrella. I leased a small apartment near downtown Richmond. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, a quiet balcony. I bought a used car, started physical therapy for my hip, and took my first class at the community centre on Monday mornings. It was called Financial Clarity After 60. The class was filled with women like me. Some were divorced, some widowed. A few had children who no longer spoke to them. We didn't dwell on the pain. We shared, we learned, and we laughed more than I expected. One morning, while waiting for the elevator in my new building, I received a thick envelope in the mail slot. The handwriting was familiar. Evan. I opened it inside, sitting by the window with a cup of lukewarm tea. His letter was long, meandering, and full of half-apologies. He spoke of Tanya's influence, of feeling pulled between loyalty and resentment. He said he hadn't realized how far things had gone, that he missed his father, that he missed me, that he didn't know what he was doing when he left me out there alone. He ended it with a line I hadn't expected. I know I have no right to ask, but if you're willing, I'd like to see you. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger, just stillness. That afternoon, I sat down with Harriet and read her the entire thing. She listened in silence, then looked at me and said, "You don't owe anyone anything that costs your peace." I nodded. Evan's letter went into a small wooden box, not in the trash, but not on the table either. Some stories don't need to be reopened. Some doors are better left shut. And sometimes healing comes not from confrontation, but from the quiet power of choosing yourself. I hadn't planned on ever stepping foot back into the house Evan and I once called ours. But the court date required my presence. The fraud charges against Tanya had moved forward quickly, and as a central witness, I was asked to attend the preliminary hearing. I arrived alone, dressed in charcoal grey slacks and a soft blouse Harriet helped me pick out. She said it made me look grounded, in control. I needed that. Curtis was already there, speaking quietly to the attorney he had hired to represent my interest in the trust. The courtroom wasn't large. It felt too small, in fact, the kind of space that made every breath echo. I took a seat behind the prosecution's table, far from where Tanya and Evan sat, their eyes avoiding mine. Tanya looked tired. Not in the way someone does after a long day. She looked like someone who knew the walls were finally closing in. She kept dabbing her temple with a tissue, pretending not to look at the judge or the papers in front of her. Evan sat stiffly beside her, hands clasped, jaw tight. He wore the same navy suit he had worn to his father's memorial. I remembered that detail, oddly, like it was part of another life. The prosecutor laid out the case in calm, firm language. The forged authorizations, the falsified identity verification documents, the attempt to reroute a $1.8 million transfer from the estate to a private offshore account in Tanya's name. The documentation was airtight. I wasn't asked to speak, just to be present, to show that I had not been complicit, that I had been the one targeted. But as I listened to the charges being read, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt numb, like the woman who had once baked lasagna in that house and stocked the guest room with lavender sachets had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. After the hearing, I declined the invitation to the post-court meeting. I needed air. I walked the block in silence, feeling the cold sting my cheeks, my fingertips going white around the knuckles. I passed a bakery where Evan used to buy lemon scones for me every Sunday morning, the kind he'd warm in the oven while I watered the plants. That memory hurt more than I expected. A week later, I received official notice. Tanya had accepted a plea deal. Restitution would be paid from her remaining assets, though it barely scratched the surface. Evan, while not charged, had been removed as executor of the trust by the judge's order. The court cited gross negligence and enabling misconduct. Curtis called that evening. He didn't gloat, just said, plainly, that it was over, that I had my name back, my financial autonomy, my dignity. I thought I'd feel relief, but all I felt was silence. I returned to my small apartment and stood on the balcony for a long while. A warm breeze rustled the old maple outside, its leaves just starting to change. I thought of my husband, how he would have handled all of this, how disappointed he'd be, but also how proud. Because I didn't break. I hadn't screamed or raged, I had endured. I sat down and wrote in my journal for the first time in months. I wrote that forgiveness wasn't owed, that some damage was permanent, and yet life kept moving, quietly, honestly, steadily forward. And that, maybe, was enough. Of all the rooms in that house, the dining room had always been mine, not legally, of course, but emotionally. It was where I hosted birthday breakfasts and quiet dinners, where Evan proposed to me decades ago over peach cobbler and candlelight. That room had known joy, and now it was the place where my son stood, fumbling with an envelope he hadn't expected to receive. I had asked the attorney to meet us there, not in his office, but in the very house Evan and Tanya had tried to quietly claim. Curtis arrived precisely at 3, with a stack of documents, a folder bearing the Whitfield family crest, and a voice that cut clean through sentiment. Tanya wasn't invited. This wasn't her day. The table was already set, not with food or flowers, but with truth, hard, cold, and waiting. Evan came alone. His face carried the exhaustion of the last few weeks. The cracks in his confidence were deeper now. He tried a smile when he walked in, but it didn't reach his eyes. He pulled out a chair, hesitated, then sat across from me. Curtis didn't waste time. He opened the folder and began reading the updated trust provisions. My husband's wishes had been reinstated. The power of attorney previously granted to Tanya was officially voided, and the remainder of the estate, what was left untouched, would be managed not by family, but by a non-profit trust I had created with Curtis's help, in Raymond's name. The silence in the room swelled. Evan swallowed hard. He kept glancing at the envelope Curtis laid before him, not yet daring to open it. "I've decided," I said, voice even, "to transfer the ranch to the Foundation for Women's Resilience. They'll convert the property into a retreat center for women rebuilding after abandonment, abuse, illness, like I did. His shoulders tensed. The ranch, he said, more a whisper than a protest. I nodded. It will serve more purpose that way than as a pawn in anyone's plan. Curtis slid the envelope across the table. This is a personal letter from your father, he said. He wrote it months before his death. We found it sealed in the estate files. He intended it to be given to you once the trust was reviewed in full. Evan's hands trembled as he picked it up. I didn't ask what it said. I didn't need to know. What mattered was what came next. I stood. My decision had already been made. The transfer paperwork had been signed, witnessed, notarized. My name was now linked to something that gave instead of being taken. The ranch would be a place of rest, of rebuilding, not of secrets or silence. Evan didn't try to stop me. He didn't plead, didn't offer apology or excuse. For the first time in this whole journey, he looked small. Not because I had diminished him, but because he had finally seen himself without the illusion Tanya had cast over him. I left him there, alone at the table. The air outside was crisp. A breeze stirred the trees, and I pulled my cardigan tight around me. I didn't cry, not for the loss of a son I no longer recognized, not for the years of loyalty that had gone unreturned. I walked to my car with quiet resolve. I wasn't walking away from a fight. I was walking toward peace. That night, I slept without waking. For the first time in months, the house didn't echo with ghosts. It pulsed with a new rhythm. The next morning, I wrote the welcome letter that would greet the first women to arrive at the retreat. I signed it with my full name, and I smiled. Not because I had won, but because I had finally chosen myself. I didn't expect the aftermath to feel like this. I had braced myself for confrontation, tears, perhaps even bitterness. But instead, what filled the silence was something far more unsettling: emptiness. Not peace, not regret. Just the slow, quiet hum of life moving on without apology. In the days that followed, I kept myself busy. The foundation work gave me purpose. Curtis and I had meetings with women from nearby shelters, trauma therapists, and community organizers. They were all excited about the ranch becoming a space of healing. One counselor cried when I walked her through the barn and told her they could use it for art therapy and yoga. I said yes before she even finished asking. And yet, beneath the surface of that new beginning, something stirred inside me. Something I hadn't wanted to look at too closely. It wasn't anger anymore. That had come and gone. Nor was it grief. That too had passed, quietly, the day I chose not to wait for Evan to be the son I needed. No, what I felt now was something older, a kind of ache I couldn't name, like the echo of something once sacred that had been quietly hollowed out over years of hoping, trusting, and finally letting go. Tanya had packed her things 2 days after the reading, or rather, she had them packed. A moving truck came early in the morning, and she didn't speak to me. She didn't even look at me, just climbed into her car, put on sunglasses, and drove away, as if I had never existed, as if the years I spent helping raise her children, holding her hand through miscarriages, watching her favorite cooking shows beside her, none of it had happened. Evan remained in the house, but not truly present. He wandered like someone walking through the ruins of a dream he once believed would come true. He never brought up the letter from Raymond. I never asked what it said. Whatever truth it held was for him alone. Curtis stopped by one evening with a small file folder. He handed it to me with a nod. Inside were the final transfer documents. The ranch was now officially under the Foundation's name. My name was listed as founder, but not as owner. I didn't need ownership anymore. What I needed was legacy. This was enough. As Curtis left, he paused on the porch. He looked at me the way only someone who has known your sorrow can. You gave him every chance, he said. I nodded, and I gave myself one. That night, I sat alone in what used to be the master bedroom. The house was quiet. Not cold, just still. I lit a single candle and placed it on the nightstand. I didn't cry. I didn't feel like I needed to. What I felt was more complicated. I thought about the first time I held Evan. His fingers were so small, his cries so urgent. I remembered how I used to hum to him in the early hours of the morning, whispering dreams into his tiny ears, imagining a life where he'd grow strong, kind, loyal. And I realized something in that moment. I had let go of Evan the man, but somewhere inside me, I still carried Evan the child. Not as a source of pain anymore, but as a memory, as a truth. He had been mine. Once. The next morning, I began packing my things. I wouldn't stay in that house. It was no longer my home. The ranch would soon be bustling with new energy, new stories. It needed space to breathe, and so did I. I called Curtis and asked him to help me find a small cabin nearby. Something quiet, close to the forest. Somewhere I could plant herbs and maybe keep a few chickens. He laughed gently and said he already had a list. And just like that, a new season began. Not with fanfare, not with apology, but with quiet resolve, and the knowledge that what I had built, both in others and in myself, would stand longer than any betrayal ever could. It took only 2 weeks to find the cabin. Tucked in a quiet pocket near the edge of the forest, it sat on a modest rise overlooking a creek and a thin stretch of wild meadow. There was a rickety porch, a chipped bird bath, and a wood-burning stove that creaked at night like an old friend remembering stories. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And more than that, it felt like peace. The first morning there, I brewed coffee and sat outside with a blanket over my knees, watching the steam rise into the cool air. I had not realized how long I had gone without silence that didn't feel like punishment. This was different. This silence felt earned. Curtis stopped by later that week with 2 women from the foundation. They'd just secured funding from a local non-profit and were eager to begin renovations on the main barn. They spoke quickly, brimming with plans, and I watched them move across the ranch from a distance. It felt like watching my old self in another time. Driven, focused, necessary. I didn't need to lead anymore. That was the difference. Now I could simply offer what I had and step back. I was done proving myself. To Evan, to Tanya, to the world. A few days later, a letter arrived. Handwritten, no return address. I recognized the slant of Evan's handwriting before I opened it. The words were careful, like someone walking barefoot across broken glass. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply said he now understood why I made the choices I did. That he had read Raymond's final letter a dozen times and found new meaning in it each time. That Tanya had left for good, and the silence she left behind had taught him more than words ever could. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it, placed it in the drawer beside my bed, and let it be. That was all it needed to be, an offering, not a solution. Later that night, I stood outside and looked up at the sky. No city lights to drown the stars here, just that vast, silent darkness, stretching over everything like a worn quilt. I realized I no longer feared what came next. I had no expectations, just space. And in that space, something began to grow. I began tending to a small garden behind the cabin. Nothing ambitious, just tomatoes, basil, and lavender. The rhythm of planting, watering, and waiting felt right. It reminded me that life wasn't only about what we lose or keep. Sometimes it was simply about what we choose to grow next. Neighbours started dropping by, curious about the new woman on the hill. They brought jars of honey, fresh eggs, and invitations to community dinners. I didn't decline. I went. I listened. I laughed when the time felt right. I wasn't who I used to be, and maybe that was the point. Maybe the hardest part wasn't losing everything. Maybe it was standing in the ashes of it all and choosing to build something quieter, something true. By the end of that week, I had one last visit to make, one last door to close. And it wasn't Evan's, it was mine, a chapter I had carried far too long. So I packed a small bag, pulled on my walking shoes, and locked the cabin door behind me. There was something waiting, not for revenge, not for closure, but for me, just me, ready to be claimed. The trail leading back to my old neighborhood looked different now, or maybe it was me who had changed. The sidewalks, once crowded with familiar faces, now felt like a distant memory. I wasn't there to visit anyone. I wasn't there to prove anything. I came for closure, not confrontation. I stopped across from the house I used to live in. The shutters were now painted a bland grey, the flower beds gone, replaced with gravel. It looked sterile, quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet that sits on the chest and won't let you breathe. I didn't go up the driveway. I didn't knock. I just stood across the street, hands in my pockets, and watched for a few minutes. Then I turned, walked away, and never looked back. Back at the cabin, I sat down with the folder Curtis had left me. Inside were the final signatures, confirming the full transition of the ranch into a trust. It was done, protected, untouchable. My legacy wouldn't belong to people who saw me as a burden. It would belong to women like me, women who needed a second start, not a second-hand life. The next morning I opened the front door to find a small box left on the step. No note, just a box. Inside was a silver bracelet I hadn't seen in years, the one I used to wear every Sunday. It had been missing since before Tanya moved in. I turned it over. On the clasp was a single initial carved in. E. I held it in my hand for a long time, not because I forgave Evan, but because I finally saw him for who he was, a broken man trying to rearrange the pieces too late. I didn't feel bitter. I felt free. Spring crept into the air, lavender bloomed around the cabin, and the days grew longer, softer. Sometimes I would sit by the creek in the evenings, listening to the wind and thinking about everything I had walked through. I no longer needed a perfect ending. I didn't need apologies to make sense of my worth. I had walked through fire and come out softer, not colder. That was enough. And so I stayed. I stayed in the quiet, in the garden, in the company of people who saw me as a person, not a possession. I taught a class on financial literacy for women rebuilding after divorce and loss. I shared what I knew. I watched them grow. I watched myself heal in their reflection. Some nights I still thought about the family I lost, but the ache no longer defined me. It became something else. A shadow I had learned to walk beside without fear. I wasn't just a mother, or a widow, or a woman who was left behind. I was me, fully, finally. And in the stillness of that truth, I had never felt more alive. If any part of my story reminded you of something you've lived through, I want you to know you're not alone. We are not defined by who turns their back on us, but by how we choose to rise after the silence. If this story stayed with you, or brought something to light in your own heart, I'd love to know. Sometimes healing begins not in answers, but in shared echoes. Take a breath. You deserve peace too.